Author Christopher Booker worked for over 30 years on his book, The 7 Basic Plots: Why We Tell Stories. This was an in-depth analysis of the fundamentals of storytelling and how these 7 are the most common for Jungian influenced stories. And if you've been following this channel for some time now, you no doubt noticed that I often compare literary practices to writing professional wrestling, as I don't see these two worlds as being mutually exclusive. I think that writing is writing, and what works well for one will no doubt work for the other. So I figure, why not break down these 7 plots? Why not see what they're all about? And why not find out what they have to offer to professional wrestling? Because today, Dave knows the 7 plots. Now, before we get into things, I want to make it clear that this is just one book on this subject, as there have been others that claim different amounts of basic plots. So again, this is just one interpretation. But when it comes to this book in specific, I do think that it's pretty interesting when we look at it from a professional wrestling context. And plus, the guy who wrote it is named Booker after all, so that's just too easy. Anyway, let's just get into the episode. The first plot that we're going to tackle is overcoming the monster. With this type of story, the protagonist sets out to defeat an antagonistic force which threatens either the protagonist himself or his homeland. This is a classic tale and probably the one that's most suited for wrestling. Many times in a story, we want to see our main character overcome something, and the story is about a difficult challenge being presented to our hero. The more difficult it seems, the better it is when the protagonist overcomes it. These stories captivate us because at their core, they're about triumph over adversity. Plots such as these in wrestling often involve things like extremely dominant heels to overcoming factions taking over a company, or even wrestlers who happen to be just straight up monsters. Next, we have what's called the rags to riches plot. Here the protagonist gains something of great value, loses it, then gains it back, but growing as a person as a result. Now, the easiest route to take here is a championship belt, of course, and one of the first examples that I think of is actually, well, Rocky 3. Rocky starts off as a champion, he loses the belt to Clubber Lang, but then he gets back the Eye of the Tiger, and the belt comes along with it. And as I'm sure you could figure, this story translates really easy to wrestling too. We could just straight up copy it, but we could also say that maybe a wrestler loses his title because of hubris, fear, or some other flaw. And we also don't have to stick to just championships either. What a wrestler loses and has to gain back could be anything. A tag partner, a manager, a spot on the team. Anything really, just as long as we establish that it means a lot and that we tie it to a specific quality of growing as a person. Then there's the quest. With this plot, the central character and some allies go on a journey in order to attain a specific goal, but facing obstacles along the way. Yeah, it's Lord of the Rings. Now, oddly, despite all of the traveling that wrestlers do in real life, this plot is one that's a bit harder to translate, because moving from physical location to location is never really a focus for professional wrestling storylines. But if we think of the journey as something other than merely covering a lot of ground, and just look at it as a series of trials to endure, then I think we can see this making a lot more sense, like with the tournament, or better yet, with the Royal Rumble. Speaking of, there's also the figurative road to WrestleMania, which can be written as something of a journey for a wrestler to take. Oh, and this plot can also be a compelling aspect that AEW's win-loss record can demonstrate, where a wrestler goes from having a terrible record to amassing wins to eventually getting a title shot. Following that, we have the voyage and the return. Our lead goes on an adventure to a strange and enticing world, but then is met with threats and must return home. Yep, this is pretty much the plot of every Disney animated movie from the 1990s. Oftentimes, this is best represented with a team of some sorts breaking up and going their separate ways for a while, but then ultimately getting back together and reconciling after their time apart. But this can also be used in interesting ways, like with the brand split, like a character treating going to a new show as a new opportunity, only to find that he was better off where he was, which they were kind of doing over and over again with Kevin Owens for a bit, so maybe I should specify that this is best used sparingly. Then we have the comedy. Now, by this, we're not just talking about being funny. In this context, we're talking about a common structure of comedic stories. And this is not to say that all comedies fit into this mold, and not saying that every film that has a specific plot is necessarily a comedy either. It's just that this formula tends to do well with the comedy genre. So what's the formula here? Well, usually it's set up by having a community that is divided by some sort of emotional problem, only to be reunited in love and harmony, which is surprisingly often depicted with with a wedding in the end. Although wrestling weddings rarely ever fit this model, so maybe that's why I hate them. And just so you know, the idea that a comedy ends with a wedding comes from William Shakespeare, since his comedies like Much Ado About Nothing end with Holy Matrimony. Of course, this all depends on what you qualify as a Shakespearean comedy, but I'm not getting into that debate. Now for wrestling, the reunion after emotional turmoil has been used for comedic effect with angles like Daniel Bryan and Kane. On the reverse side of things we have tragedy. This is where the central character has a central flaw that results in their own demise, and where a comedy has you rooting for the lead and then celebrating their success, a tragedy on the other hand has us feeling sympathy for the main character when we witness their downfall. And what makes for a more tragic tale is that the flaw or mistake needs to be something understandable or easy to solve, but for one reason or another it just never gets resolved, thus making it more arduous because the tragedy was so close to not having to happen. Then the last official plot is the rebirth. This is when a catalyst causes the main character to change his ways to become a better person. We see this with stories like A Christmas Carol. It's also very popular with TV shows of the modern era, where it's all about a boss protagonist with a rough history going down the road to redemption. There you have it, the 7 basic plots. But if you feel that that's not all there is to it, well, you would be right. For starters, if you feel like this doesn't cover every single story out there, that's totally fine, as I don't think it does either. And you know what? Neither did this book, because allow me to remind you that these 7 plots are just the most common in Jungian storytelling according to the book's author, Christopher Booker. And not only that, but Booker has also included 2 bonus plots in his book. The first of which was the rebellion against the One. Here we have the protagonist who is imbued with some sort of force, if you will, which he is resistant against until he learns to embrace it, and then he becomes a master of it. Yeah, it's Star Wars. But it's also stories like The Matrix and Harry Potter too. As for the other bonus plot, it's a mystery. I mean, the plot is called The Mystery, it's not itself. Anyway, you get my point. Here the plot begins with a riddle of sorts, normally under the guise of a crime. The main character then sets out to solve the riddle. And when it comes to what it takes to make a good mystery angle in professional wrestling, well, that's gonna have to wait till another episode. Now, you might have noticed that some of these plots can sometimes have threads that intersect with one another, or that some stories tend to have a combination of plots. And that is totally okay, and it actually makes for more complex storytelling. Even among the examples I've given, you can see how some of them have multiple elements from different plots all mixed together. And by doing this, it makes for stories that are just so much more compelling. And one of my favorite ways to do this is to have one main character going through one or more plots, while another main character is going through others. For example, a story could use overcoming the monster as a plot for the hero, but if you look at things from the monster's point of view, the story would actually be considered a tragedy. Well, there you have it, just some thoughts on the 7 basic plots of storytelling. What are some wrestling storylines that you could think of that fit one or more of these plots? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like this kind of thing, please also check out my comic book channel, Dave Knows Comics. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.